Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Small Business Essentials. Just a couple things before we get started. One, we are recording today so that anyone else who wants to see it but couldn't be with us today can watch later on our website. And two, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat or the Q&A functions down at the bottom of your screen. We'll stop every once in a while if we have some questions, and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for general Q&A. Okay, every industry expert will tell you that no two commercial leases are the same. So no matter how many of them you've signed, how long you've been in business, there's always going to be something new you can learn. So back again today to discuss the ins and outs of commercial leases are Samantha Wagner of Iowa Legal Aid and Nora Walsh as SVN Create. Thank you both so much for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks for having us back.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're happy to be here. I think Nora and I can talk about this stuff all day, so we'll try to keep it to an hour. I'll go ahead, if you want to move this slide forward. I'll go ahead and let Nora introduce herself, and we will go ahead and get started.
Yes, so as Zach already introduced me, Nora Walsh, I'm an associate advisor at SVN Commercial Real Estate. We are a brokerage company, so we represent landlords, sellers, tenants, and buyers in all commercial transactions and leases. So excited to be here.
And how long have you been doing that, Nora?
So I started on the property management side for 2 years, and now I've been on the brokerage side for 3 years. So kind of learning all the ins and outs there. And we cover all the sectors. So whether it's retail, industrial, office, ground up development, a lot of different avenues.
I think Nora is such a tremendous resource for her clients and for other professionals like me who kind of just want to gut check, like, hey, is this normal? Or, what can I expect out of this situation? So if you have not worked with her yet, I would highly encourage it. My name is Samantha Wagner. I'm an attorney at Iowa Legal Aid. We provide free legal services for folks who qualify for our help. I've been practicing for about 5 years now, and prior to my current job, I worked doing a couple of different things like this in Texas, so wide breadth of experience. Just to talk a little bit, if you want to move to the next slide, about our project. Our services are free. We provide, we help nonprofits and low-income entrepreneurs. We try to focus on folks who would not otherwise have access to legal counsel. And with commercial leases, having access to legal counsel and to a real estate agent to help you through this process is really, really crucial. So we help folks who are at or around the 200% of the poverty line. But I will tell you that if you think you are close or, really you just want to try anyway, we do make some exceptions. And we would, really think about making an exception to help with someone's commercial lease, because we see it as such a source, such a needed service for our clients. So please, if you need help with your commercial lease, we encourage you to apply.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't come across those services free too often. And I think it's something that people overlook. Say, hey, I can read through this real quick and get a gist of it, but not knowing all the ins and outs, legal is very, very important. So I always refer everything over to a legal advisor. And I always give that preface, I'm like, here's my tips and tricks, but always have a legal advisor check it over. And there's my intro page. So I already kind of
your new headshot is so glamorous.
Thank you. Fun story. I did my makeup in the car that day. I was very excited. I said, this is COVID starting. And I said, hey, well, I'm doing no makeup today. And I ran into my boss outside and he goes, oh, okay, fresh face for our headshots. I said, oh no, I ran to Walgreens and got some mascara. So yeah, it's funny, but this is our growing team. So we now have some new teammates that also provide property management services as well as project management. So if there's like a ground up construction or a complete kind of demo remodel, they can just kind of be a good resource for determining what's the big price, what's the best way to save kind of money and sourcing that way. So that's all my contact information, and I know they'll send out a recording afterwards.
Very good. And here is how to get in touch with us. If you go to the Iowa Legal Aid website, we list all of the information. You can also apply online, and right now that probably is the fastest way to get on the list. It's certainly faster than emailing me. So if you are looking for help, you should apply, either call during the times that we are open, or apply online.
Very great. And I'd say it's probably never too early to start, just, get an idea of things probably from either of our professions. You'll start getting those questions from landlords and whatnot right away, and just getting prepared for that. I think you're already taking the first step if you're watching this video though.
Absolutely. You can go ahead and move forward. Just so y'all know, there is some coronavirus related information available on our website. If you or someone you know is having an issue related to COVID, so anything from employment or, you name it, evictions, anything like that, we are a resource available, regardless of whether you think you would normally qualify for legal aid's help. So just wanted to put a plug in there for that quick.
Great.
So today we're discussing general legal information. I cannot discuss specific situations, so please try to keep your questions general. Lawyers always love to have a good disclaimer. So
That's why we're fun.
that's why we're so much fun at parties. So here's the thing. Just because it almost seems sometimes to me that people get so excited about opening their storefront and starting off this big new exciting part of their life, in leasing some space, that it's almost like they get so excited and they leave their good business sense at the door. So really what it comes down to when you're thinking about commercial leases is basic contracts 101 principles. If you keep that kind of basic good business judgment stuff in mind, you'll be in good shape. Don't get so excited by, all the exciting parts of moving into a new space that you overlook whether it really is a good investment. So, and I'm sure Nora and I can tell you some horror stories about this, but please get things in writing. If there is something that you and the landlord agree to that maybe is outside the norm, or I'm going to move in, but I don't want to move in until X, Y, and Z are replaced, make sure that the final writing reflects your final agreement, because otherwise you could be out of luck. And even if you're not out of luck, you're going to have to get an attorney involved, and that's expensive, that takes time, that takes money. So please make sure that the final writing includes everything that you guys talked about up to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nora, do you have any other tips?
Yeah, I was just going to absolutely stress that. So if you haven't been in a lease negotiation before, typically you will start with a letter of intent, which is just kind of a summarized version. Hey, this is the term that we're expecting. This is the rental rate that we are expecting. We would like the landlord to perform, convert the space, maybe put in some built-in offices if it's currently a wide open space. And a lot of these, conversations occur verbally, or this letter of intent is not legally binding. So maybe you have it there. That's the first thing I ever do, is once we get something kind of agreed upon in paper, then once it comes to the lease negotiations, it's the first thing I do is I say, okay, we want to make sure it's now officially made it to the lease document. Because sometimes when you have these verbal conversations, or even if it's an exchange in email and they say, yep, sounds good, it does not mean it always makes it to that document. So you really want to be sure of that. And just like Samantha said, sometimes you can just get so excited about it. And landlords, it's not necessarily that they're all going to be skeevy. Sometimes it can be by accident. But when it comes down to it, then, you have your back covered and you can say, hey, you owed me this construction work before moving in, or we talked about 2 months of rent abatement so that I had, time to fit up my space without paying rent when I wasn't actually making any money yet. I also like the point that you have about shop around and negotiate. You can use that as a leverage point. You can have 2 non-legally binding documents, or even 3. You probably don't want to do too many more than that. Otherwise, you're going to get your head probably blow up a little bit. But you can use that as a negotiating point and say, hey, you know what, we're negotiating with Mr. Landlord X, and Mr. Landlord Y is, agreeing for a shorter lease term or a lower rate, more rent abatement, kind of various things. So you can use that to your benefit, but also it's kind of hard not to just fall in love with the first location that you look at. Maybe you've seen one that maybe you always envisioned yourself in East Village, but when you're kind of checking things out, the different shops, then you realize, hey, this is actually a much better agreement. It makes more sense for my business plan. So try to, not get overly excited and still keep your options open, because someone can come in and lease that space as well. It's not always a guaranteed thing. Just because you're negotiating doesn't mean that they can't lease it out to someone else.
Absolutely. And, along with making sure that those things are in writing, make sure that you understand before you are signing anything. Ask questions. If someone tells you not to worry about a certain provision, that should raise a red flag for you, right? Want to make sure you get clarity on that. And, a lot of these things are templates. They are, hey, this is the thing we use with everybody. So make sure that, to the extent that y'all have agreed on something that deviates a little bit, that's reflected in the final agreement. And Nora brings up a really important point, which is that nobody knows your business like you do, right? Maybe you've always envisioned, yourself in one place, but maybe something else might be a better fit, or might be different than what you had thought. With that said, though, you want to make sure that you figure out what your needs are, and you want to make sure that that space will accommodate those needs. So, for example, if you are a business that relies on a lot of foot traffic, make sure that you are checking out what the foot traffic looks like at different parts of the day. Maybe it's super busy during the sort of 9 to 5 workday, but anytime after hours or on the weekends, it's just dead. And to the extent that your business model depends on that foot traffic, that might make a difference for you. Mm-hmm. Similarly, maybe you don't care about foot traffic, but you care about parking, or you care about having a loading zone or something like that. So these are the kinds of things that I'm always telling people to really think about, along with sometimes certain businesses like to be near another kind of business, because customers who shop at one place might want to hit your business on the way home. So it's worth taking a look at who else is in the area. Nora?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of those are just so overlooked. You mentioned with kind of co-tenancy. I think that's a big one, and it kind of has two sides to it. You want to make sure that it coincides in the sense that you were talking about parking. So let's say you have a chiropractor who primarily, they practice from 7:30 a.m. to 3 p.m., maybe 4 p.m. They typically have a little bit of earlier hours, but that takes up a significant amount of parking. There's a lot of people going in and out, so it takes up a lot of parking. If your adjacent co-tenant is a bar owner, it might not matter too much, because their hours of operation are really more in the evening, so it might not really affect it. But you got to keep that in mind, because that's very high volume of parking as well. On the flip side, you could also pay attention to co-tenants that could be beneficial to you. We have a landlord he's a veterinary practice, and we think it would be a great use for someone with pet supplies or something along those lines. People are already in the area for their pet. They make it a regular part of their routine. Maybe they're kind of waiting while their pet's next door. They can just kind of meander in, and they get a lot of extra foot traffic from that way. So there's kind of two parts when you're considering co-tenancy. You want to make sure it's not something that's going to.
Oh dear.
All right.
Always an adventure on Zoom. Sam.
Sure. So I'm not sure where exactly Nora left off, but she was talking about thanks COVID is right. Some of the different things that you want to make sure that you're observing or taking into consideration. Welcome back, Nora.
Sorry about that.
and a few things I will put on your radar include considerations like, do you need access to restrooms for your store? Or is it a place where someone would need access to a lactation room? Is there something like that that's sort of central to central to, the whole area or the whole premises and you might need for your business. Similarly, some folks really need something like a waiting room or a waiting area that they could have access to. So really, it does depend on what your business needs. I always, some of the stories that Nora has told me about her big wins in negotiating these types of agreements have included really amazing discrepancies in shopping around, basically. So I remember Nora telling me, that one of your customers or the clients you were working with had their heart set on a place, but the landlord was insisting on a 10-year term, but you were able to get them down to 5 years through savvy and your, sort of expertise. And so don't accept the first thing you see. It really helps to shop around.
Yeah, typically, obviously a landlord is going to look out for their own interests. They want you to be successful because they want you to pay rent, but they're always going to have kind of their best interests in mind. This is their business model, so their first offer is typically not going to be even close to as aggressive as you'll really get. And of course, it's going to be different with every landlord, and that's why you want to kind of try to work a couple different deals and see who's willing to be the most flexible with you and get you to the closest to your goal. Because yeah, just like you had said, I know exactly which tenant you're talking about. And that was, she said, absolutely not. She was she was ready to walk away. And, sometimes that's all it takes. And they say, wait. So, they had seen her. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely don't accept the first offer that they make for you.
Yeah. Nora, do you have any thoughts about ADA requirements?
Yeah, actually. So something that people, I'm working with a nonprofit right now, and they were very shocked. In order to get their funding, they require ADA compliance. And they were pretty surprised that a lot of these locations aren't already ADA compliant. You'd think in 2021, but if it's it's an older building, they just get kind of grandfathered in. So it's not necessarily a requirement. I feel like a lot of people just kind of want that in their business, be more inclusive, and you can ask a landlord to do that. This nonprofit that we were working with, they fell in love with the location, and it was handicap accessible from the entryway, and it had an elevator, but the restrooms upstairs were not compliant for ADA. We did kind of come up with a pretty cost-efficient solution. They had 2 stalls in there, and they said, hey, we're okay with just making it one individual, taking out the stalls. The width of the door was already sufficient. And so there would be like a little bit of changes with the plumbing to make sure that was at the proper height, and put in, some grab bars. But it was a pretty cost efficient request, especially since the office space that they fell in love with, it was move-in ready. So they said, hey, we don't need you to put any money into the office. So if you can make this ADA compliant to the restroom, it's only going to be more beneficial to not only our clientele, but most likely any other clientele that you have for the other office users. But yeah, don't just expect it already to be ADA compliant. If it's a newer construction, it should be. But you'll definitely want to keep an eye out that just for your general clientele, employees. But we're in 2021 now, so we want to try to be as inclusive as possible.
Do y'all mind if I jump in for 1 second? I'm sorry. We are, just to add a little more info, we are actually doing a full Small Business Essentials, one of these next month, on ADA compliance for both
awesome.
your physical structure and your website. And in addition, just creating a more inclusive experience for your customer base. So check back. Our website should be updated with next quarter's events very soon, in the next couple weeks.
I love that. You'll have to send me that invite. I'll send that over to my nonprofit.
That's so convenient. What a great opportunity. Another organization you might consult is Disability Rights Iowa. They're pretty good at helping folks figure that stuff out. So there's a number of different types of commercial leases, and basically classifying who's paying for what is kind of what it comes down to. It's my opinion that the lease classification doesn't really matter, so long as you understand what's in it, and you remember that just because you've done business with someone before doesn't mean that this new lease is the same. So, no matter what kind of lease you have, you should always exercise precaution. You want to move to the next slide?
Yes.
So again, what is a net lease, right? You hear different folks talking about, well, this is a double net lease or this is a triple net lease. And really it comes down to what things are your responsibility to pay and what things are the landlord's responsibility to pay. So depending on what type of lease you have, that can sort of depend. Again, I don't think it super matters, only to the extent that you understand what you're on the hook for. Nora, do you have
exactly. And you can ask for estimates. So a triple net lease is typically the most common rental structure that we see. So that basically means that you are paying your rent, you have property taxes, insurance, operating expenses, and then you have utilities. So you can ask the landlord beforehand, just because you're paying that separately. You say, hey, I want an estimate of what those expenses are. So they'll give you what last year's expenses were, or if it's new construction and maybe the building's not fully assessed, so the taxes will go up, they'll give you that breakdown so that you can really know what to expect. Sometimes if a landlord can be, lenient enough, maybe they don't have a significant amount of tenants, they might be willing to work with you. And if it's too difficult for you to do a triple net structure, you might be able to ask them, hey, can I do a modified gross? Or can I do a full service gross, which is where you just pay one lump sum to the landlord, or maybe you only pay, utilities or just insurance. So there's some different options, but just like Sam said, just make sure that you are aware of everything that goes into it. Okay, if I'm paying insurance, if I'm paying taxes, what can I expect to come next year and then upcoming years, so that you can really budget for that, because that definitely kills deals.
It's going to affect everything in your business model too.
Mm-hmm.
How much are you going to charge for services? Well, what are your expenses?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It really relates to everything. So if you want
And
to
just kind of knowing what your business model, if it's a restaurant or something which it uses significantly more water, you want to account that into your utilities. Maybe everyone else, if it's a mixed use building, everyone else is an office user, they're not going to use nearly as much as you. So just make sure that you're taking that into account, and so is your landlord.
Absolutely. So I love terribly done Photoshop. So hopefully you are not surprised by the snake in the hand instead of the flowers after attending this presentation. But, by understanding all the true costs associated with your lease, you're going to be better able to make business decisions that will hopefully lead to a successful, thriving business. And like Nora said, a lot of landlords are super helpful in, helping you make this decision by providing estimates, or, here's what it has cost, the property taxes in the past 3 years, so you can kind of get a sense of where it will be approximately, or here's what the common area maintenance fee has been for the past couple years, so that you'll be able to, kind of have some idea of what that will look like.
Mm-hmm.
But, generally speaking, it's always better to go into something fully aware of the possibilities rather than to be surprised. Some things that my clients have been surprised by include a snow removal fee, a trash removal fee, an additional cost to put your business's name on the marquee out front, all sorts of requirements about what kinds of signs you can put on the building, if any. I had a client who unfortunately found out that she was on the hook if the HVAC broke, even though she wasn't the one who installed it in the first place. So again, you really want to make sure that you understand what you're getting into.
Yeah, I liked that you brought up things like signage and everything as well, because in addition to the kind of standard operating expenses that you have, you also want to be getting a quote. If you're not moving into a turnkey, or at least very close to, which just means move-in ready space, if you like this brand new construction in Waukee, and that's shell space, you need to take into account how much the construction is going to cost. And you can get a bid beforehand. You don't want to have a lease signed until you're aware of those costs, because people are blown away, especially nowadays. Construction costs are skyrocketing. So we're seeing a lot of people be more clever and kind of maybe reutilizing space in new ways so that they can be more cost efficient. But you really want to make sure that you also have that figured out before signing a lease, because it is a huge, huge expense. Sometimes the landlord will say, hey, we can we can put it over your lease term. And they say, well, that's great. What a great solution. And then they realize how much it is. And they're like, the people will go out of business for reasons like that because they can't maintain it. So.
And I think people really get fixated, especially when it's your first time or you're a new business owner, right? Oh, my rent is this. And it's like, well, yes, that is your rent, but really it's more like this amount by the time you kind of calculate all these different fees. And that sort of puts things in perspective. So again, hopefully after today, you will be able to avoid that. So let's talk a little bit about operating expense considerations. So when we talk about this, we're generally talking about things that, an expense, sometimes it's called the common area maintenance fees, that help with things that have to do kind of with the building at large. So cleaning, protecting things, lighting, security systems, repairing, replacing, sometimes heating or air conditioning, the building, parts that maybe it's outside of your premises, but it's on the way to the bathroom or something like that. So when you are, taking a look at these types of expenses, some suggestions that I have are to try to exclude capital improvements, depreciation of the building equipment, costs that benefit the tenant or the landlord's overhead, and try to keep it to, okay, what are the actual expenses that I, directly benefit from, and not just sort of their depreciation. It's a good idea, if you can, to get a cap in place so that you can limit how much this can be increased year over year. Usually it's the case that folks are given a projection and then it kind of is reconciled at the end of the year and that amount is passed forward. But I will say that, it's really helpful to make sure that you have audit rights to make sure that that process is done correctly. The projection and reconciliation process, that is. However, it is pretty expensive to do that. So while it's a great right to have, you may not ever actually exercise it. The other thing I would say is to take note of the age of the building. Certainly with technology, different requirements commonly can get property management fees capped. So something to think about. Any other considerations there, Nora?
Also, if you're in a multi-tenant building, if you know any of the tenants that are already in there, or even if you don't, and you just kind of want to pop in and have a conversation, hey, I could be your future co-tenant, your future neighbor, and just be friendly and kind of see if there's any red flags. Just like you mentioned with the age of the building, sometimes that really affects what the operating expenses are. The utilities, if it's not properly sealed, we deal with that in industrial a lot. If it's really kind of the older structure and it's not retaining heat or HVAC very well, that can really affect your expenses there. And just knowing, just kind of like we've reiterated, everything that goes into it. For example, I know there's kind of been a lot of restaurant startups with COVID. People have, catering businesses and food trucks and stuff that have been able to find success during this time and convert into bricks and mortar. There's a lot that can go into it if you're getting a second generation space. Grease trap is huge. It's incredibly expensive. You can have to dig up the concrete. Polk County is very strict about it, and it's a requirement. So that's more of kind of a construction cost, but once again, just knowing everything that goes into it, that could be something that's pre-existing. So asking a landlord, hey, if there's been a restaurant there in the past, can we tap into the existing grease trap? Do we have to put one in ourselves? Are you putting it in? Being very clear about who's providing what, because those expenses, really want to drive that home.
And who's repairing what, right? Like,
yeah.
Are you going to be on hand if that something goes wrong with that, or is that going to be on me? So these are all and honestly, having this expertise in these experiences is a really good reason why you should work with a commercial real estate agent, because they can help you think of the things that you maybe hadn't thought about for some of these.
Yeah, and little things like HVAC that happens in pretty much every lease. I feel like landlords always try to put it all back on when really it should be just very general kind of maintenance, changing out filters for a tenant and everything any other kind of repairs or replacement should be on the landlord. And they'll definitely try to stick you with that.
For sure. So what should I try to negotiate before I sign? The obvious answer is anything that you don't like and you want to change.
Mhm.
But, here are a few things that we suggest. Permitted uses. So this often comes up in, I forget the name of the term, but the sort of competition clauses that say, what sorts of uses that you can have in a certain premises. So, for example, one I think about a lot is a client who moved in and had an ice cream business. And in the same strip mall, there was a coffee shop business, right? So you could not compete with the coffee shop business. That's all good and fine. We've got ice cream, we've got coffee. What happens if you want to make a coffee shake with, ice cream? Is that going to be a competing use?
Mm-hmm.
So, to the extent that, you think, oh, well, I'm never going to be in the coffee business. That's fine. Well, sometimes these things do tend to spill over in unexpected ways as your business evolves. Similarly, I had a client who signed a lease and agreed not to compete with other businesses, but wasn't given that same assurance by the landlord, and a directly competing business moved in next door. So, these are things that you should try to think about before you sign.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, something Nora was talking about is getting a shorter term. So, if especially with a new business or something that's uncertain, I would be willing to pay a little bit more just to have that shorter term and just, give me that space to try and to figure out if this business is going to work or not. Nora, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, something that we're seeing a lot of right now, especially in the office space, kind of varying with retail, but a lot in office, is finding workarounds like a sublease. If someone has vacated, they're working 100% virtual, but you're a business where you really need to be in person, or you're just kind of ready to go back. A lot of times you can kind of get around it, even if a landlord, maybe their minimum term would only be 3 years. 3 to 5 years is pretty standard. But once again, if you're kind of starting off and you want to test the waters, you might be able to get a sublease position so that you're only taking on maybe a year and a half. A lot of times with that, you're able to get a lower rate as well, because the prior tenant will offload some of that. Maybe they're paying some of the utilities or some of the rent for you, just so that they're not locked in for that remaining year and a half when they know that they're just not going to be utilizing it. So exclusives is what we kind of call with those co-tenancy terms, the
Yes.
kind of having the exclusive agreement there. And once again, even if you use coffee as an example, and I had that with a coffee shop as well. The landlord didn't want to approve of an exclusive for a coffee shop. He was a coffee shop, and he said, well, what if we have a breakfast place like a Jimmy's Egg, and they serve coffee, but it's not, then we can't even permit them. So we said, okay, if it's 10% or less of their sales, then it can be permitted. So little things like that, there may be some wiggle room. So just like you mentioned with shakes, maybe you're not going to be utilizing that much, but if you want to have some sort of allotment so that you have the ability to be the most flexible, and also just determining any future services that you could be utilizing in the future, because you definitely want to account for that. And once again, going back to having it in writing, I can't tell you how many times I've had a landlord say, no, there's no exclusive on that. And we've been concerned because we say, hey, there's a nail salon right there, and we know the services can be similar. And he said, no, it's fine. It's fine. And then when it came back to them actually going through the lease, maybe that tenant's been there for a while and they forgot and said, oh, they do have an exclusive. Never mind, you can't do it. So once again, goes back to having it all in writing, because they can say whatever verbally, but it's ridiculous how many times that's actually happened. So
oh, that's so annoying.
Yep, especially when it's one of the first things that we bring up and say, hey, we want to make sure there's not an exclusive. So also why it's good to keep your options open and kind of explore a couple different things, because you never know what'll pop up.
Yeah, not to get your heart set on the first place you see. Always good to have, flexible renewal options. So how soon do you have to give notice? What does that look like? What's the price increase going to be? Again, certainty is helpful while allowing you the maximum flexibility. And we've
Mhm.
talked a little bit about common areas, but I had a client who really went out of business because his clients couldn't find anywhere to park. So to the extent that this really depends on sort of and gosh, I forget what the term the lease had in it, but it was something like we will all get along or we will all respect one another. And it's like, well, that's not an enforceable.
It's incredibly vague.
How many parking spots does that
Yeah.
mean? Like, what? So again, and the other thing I want to emphasize, and I think I forgot to mention this earlier, is you never have as much leverage to negotiate as you do before you sign. When you are shopping around and negotiating, you have all the power. Once you sign the lease, you don't have that power anymore. So you really want to make sure that that lease and in that process of negotiating to get there reflects everything that that you're hoping to get.
Absolutely. And kind of goes back to, if you're not sure of everything, obviously, we're good resources, real estate and legal. But also if you know someone in a similar business, definitely ask them questions. Hey, what do you wish that you knew starting out? Just little things like the parking can make a world of a difference, or being located at a full turn intersection versus a little bit tucked away, not realizing how important the visibility is, or signage. Just little things that you might not think add up to a lot. If you know anyone in the industry, it's always good to kind of pick their brain as well and say, hey, what do you think could have been more efficient? Because especially being in a place like Des Moines and Iowa, I think people are very friendly and very open to helping other small business owners.
And I always talk with people about that, especially when you're thinking about risks in your business. And so that can be a great opportunity to make use of a mentor or a breakfast club or some sort of professional group that you're a part of.
Absolutely.
So we kind of talked a little bit about permitted uses. So one, zoning, are you allowed to do what you want to do in that location? And two, is there an exclusive or competitive use? So most standard leases are 3 to 5 years. Many businesses do not exist after 3 years, let alone 5. That is the unfortunate reality of entrepreneurship. Consider negotiating for a higher price but a shorter length to give you better options. And Nora really highlighted why that can be, some good ideas for how to do that. And again, when you're thinking about term, make sure you take a look at what that term actually looks like. Well, our year actually runs from, our fiscal year is from June to June, or, so that you're fully appreciating what all is included. So if, the landlord is offering you free rent for the first 3 months, but still requires operating expenses from the beginning of the term, it's not really free. It's not really free rent the first couple months, right? Or if they're still required to make improvements and you can't move in until those improvements are done, maybe your term doesn't start until, you actually start paying rent. And if you move in later, does that change when the first year is up? Making sure that you really nail down those definitions can be important. And again, the option to renew or the option to exit. I love building in an exit. Tried it, it didn't work, so let's be done. Really creates a lot of clarity and removes a lot of uncertainty about, lawsuits and things like that when you no longer are able to afford the lease.
I really like the points that you made about kind of, when you're occupying the space, when you actually start paying rent. Because a lot of people think they're getting a freebie with like, oh, I'm getting a month of no rent, not realizing that that's just very kind of standard practice. Maybe you're putting money into building out the space, bringing everything in. You're not up in operation yet, so it'd be very hard to expect you to start paying rent. And being aware that, hey, just because I'm getting free rent doesn't necessarily mean you're not paying for operating expenses or you're not paying for utilities, because a lot of times the landlord will try to get you to pay that. Also, another reason why it's so important, the use of language, is we use that. It can be so fickle when it comes down to construction timing. So we always try to use something like, the completion 2 months prior or after the completion of construction expected to be or anticipated to be, so that if it doesn't end up being completed by that time, you still say it was anticipated to be by that date, but the landlord, you pushed it 2 weeks back. Therefore, I'm not actually starting to pay rent until it's been officially 2 months since the completion of construction or something along those lines. So that's super important to consider.
Absolutely. So, what's included in rent? Is it a fixed amount? Is there an annual increase? Does it include a percentage of your gross income? If so, how is that defined? What counts as income? Some landlords can be flexible with the base rent in order to allow somebody to try out a new idea, or you're a beginning business and they want to be helpful. But in exchange, they sometimes like to come along with you and say, well, I'm going to take a share of a portion of the amount of money you make. And especially in things like restaurants or retail stores, I've seen those provisions. So again, it all comes down to making sure that you understand what that's actually going to look like. Is it your gross income? Is it your net income? Do you get any deductions? Is it only for the first year? Do you get any flexibility if the business slows down? Is it monthly or the year, the year as a whole? So for example, if the landlord is taking 2% of your gross revenues, is it 2% over the course of the year, or is it 2% every month? Because maybe you're a retail business and you have a lot of sales in the holiday season, but it really kind of dries up in February. So doing it by month might actually mean that you pay more. So again, you really want to make sure that you're understanding what you're paying and what that's going to look like.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of crosses into the next one with the percentage. Also thinking of that in your renewal terms. A lot of times the language can be a little bit tricky, just like Sam was saying before, similar to like an audit, a lot of times you can negotiate to have an agreement where it says, you'll mutually agree upon market rent when it comes upon your renewal term. That can be so messy. I always try to encourage people to try to get a stated rate in place, because it can get really messy. Sure, yeah, you can, how long is it going to take for you guys to agree on? You can get lawyers involved. You can get, it just can be very costly. And you really want to try to have an actual rate that you agree on, because or even if it's a percentage
is giving me
increase.
anxiety thinking about that. Market rate. Okay, well, what's the market? Is it West Des Moines? Is it Des Moines? Is it Iowa? Is it Polk County? Right? Lawyers are such a pain.
Yeah, and you can pretty much find comps to back anything up. So whatever your point is, it would just end up being so much messier, and you can kind of screw yourself out of the ability to renew if you guys just can't agree on it. So little things like that are important to consider. And
we've really tried to highlight that you want to create the most flexible situation for yourself. So what if when it comes time to renew your lease, you're doing really awesome and your business is really killing it. Maybe you want to stay in the same location, but you want to expand. Maybe that's the type of right that you'd want to secure for yourself. Yeah. Similarly, if the landlord expands, what happens if they have a bunch of construction projects going on and that really negatively impacts your business, right? What sorts of requirements are they going to have for signage or access to your store, parking? To the extent that they're thinking about growing their business too, this is something to really think about and to bake into these renewal provisions.
Yeah, having like something like a right of first refusal is definitely important, especially if you're not sure what your growth looks like. It's pretty standard to request that of the landlord. So if you're, maybe you just start off with 1,000 square foot bay, whether you're a restaurant or office space, you typically would just want to kind of ask for the right of first refusal for the adjacent tenant space. In the case that they were to relocate, or their lease expires before yours, if you realize that you need to expand, makes a lot more sense to kind of expand in place than say, oh, well, I'm screwed. Now I got to find an entirely new location because I can't just expand into the adjacent bay. So I did that recently with a food manufacturer. He was really blowing up, but he said, I don't think I could do 20,000 square feet. We need to start with 10,000 square feet. Be realistic. This is what we can do. And so we found a position where it was a food grade manufacturer next door, because being FDA requirements, very difficult to come across. And the guy was coming close to retirement. So we said, okay, cool. Then we'll ask for the right of first refusal. And he's expanding so fast. He said, hey, I really need to get in that space next door. And the guy is complying. He's close enough to retirement. So the landlord's relocating him there. So then he gets to expand within, and he doesn't have to worry about, oh, now I have to leave my lease early because I grew too fast. So yeah, it's a really reasonable request to include.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple thoughts about common areas. If you want to move the slides forward. So how much are you paying versus how much are you using it? Is this the sort of thing that's going to be more expensive as time goes on? So what happens if somebody trips and falls in the bathroom? Is that your problem? Is that the landlord's problem? Who's paying for that insurance? When does it actually become part of your premises? How are you going to enforce your ability to use? Do your homework, right? Nora was talking about talking with the other, co-tenants in that area. So what does parking look like? Is the landlord responsive if there are issues with getting access to, the common area, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other things to look out for include a continuous operation provision. So make sure that this is adjusted to reflect your business schedule. If you have a business and, it's not uncommon for people to say, hey, February is my slow month, so we're closed for that whole month. We really focus, we're a costume business, so we focus on, October through December, something like that. Make sure that your lease doesn't say that you have to be open, year round. Subrogation clauses. So to the extent sometimes the landlord will require you to carry certain types of insurance to protect the landlord if someone sues the landlord for something that happens in your space. So again, you're going to want to make sure that you have adequate insurance, and that's another cost that you probably hadn't thought about. We talked a little bit about vacancies or permitted uses, who gets to control what goes into a vacant space. And these sort of exculpatory clauses that protect the landlord from being liable from damages, even if they are the one who causes the problem. So, a good thing to try to get removed. Attorney's fees. Again, attorneys are expensive. If there is some sort of dispute between you and the landlord, you could be on the hook to pay the landlord's attorney's fees if you lose. So this is something that you want to go in with your eyes wide open about. Similarly, what's going to happen to fixtures installed when you move out? Does that automatically become the property of the landlord, or do you have a reasonable, time to turn it back into sort of that, vanilla box status?
Huge one. That's a huge one. Yeah.
To the extent that you want to make improvements and you want to change how your store looks from time to time, you may be required to get landlord permission, and you're going to want to be very clear about what you sort of have the discretion to do and what's going to require the landlord's permission.
Mm-hmm.
So, try to negotiate a time period for the landlord to respond and the right to make, things that you can change. So I would say it'd be reasonable to be able to paint without having the landlord involved. But maybe when you're, installing some sort of fixture, that might be when they want to get involved. I don't,
Or anything that requires maybe pulling a permit if you're moving walls around and you have to pull a permit for it.
Yes, exactly. So, provisions you should try to include cure language. So technically, there are a lot of different things that could happen. So let's say you're required to keep the sidewalks in front of your store cleared because during the winter time, but technically that could be a default on your lease if you haven't done that or whatever. you know, you want to build in language that says, hey, as long as I'm making a reasonable effort upon receiving notice, this isn't going to be a default. You don't want to deal with some sort of stupid thing like that comes up. If your business relies on one or more anchor stores, or, you know, kind of like Nora was talking about with the, you know, a pet groomer or a pet supply business, you know, consider asking for reduced rent or an option to terminate if that, you know, co-tenant you're relying on closes. And, you know, sometimes landlords will consider building in an ability to terminate early for a failure to achieve certain performance levels. You know, I love having an exit plan, though I think landlords are less excited about that.
And something else to consider is, I mentioned a sublease, is if you're in that position yourself, getting the ability to sublease the space. Typically, it's still going to have to be, you know, the credit's still going to have to be approved by the landlord, or the use if it's a different user. They'll still have to check into those things to make sure that they're able to pay the rent. But that's also another option that you could ask for, is the ability to sublet the space. You'll have to probably outline those terms a little bit more, how much that, you know, you're going to pay versus the tenant. Once again, the landlord's probably going to need to approve of their finances and make sure that they're sufficient to take your place, but another just kind of exit strategy option.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about default, and then we can leave some time for questions. But you know, what happens if I can't pay my lease anymore? Well, what's going to happen? Well, first we need to take a look at what your lease says. As with everything, you know, this can be unique and dependent on the terms of your lease. So some things that I have seen happen include locking a tenant out of a property based on, you know, not paying the rent, or being able to seize the property that's located, the inventory located in the premises, to sort of recoup losses from not being paid. So this became an issue in a case I had really early on in my tenure at Iowa Legal Aid. And the client really wanted to liquidate and sell all their inventory, but the landlord was saying, no, that's our security to make sure we get paid. So we were kind of stuck in this stalemate to figure out what was the best thing to happen. So do you want to move forward a little bit? So that's an example of one of those clauses. So, you know, can you move forward? It's in everyone's interest to reach an agreement, but you can't force people to be reasonable. Yes, this is true. What happens if my landlord won't negotiate and I can't pay? So the most common lease terms that I see are these accelerated rent and lease termination provisions, which say, okay, the entire remaining balance of your lease is going to be due, and we're going to kick you out of the space. So in theory, you'd be paying for something that you wouldn't even have access to. Most likely, if you can't pay the rent, that's not an option for you. So they're going to try to sue you for the balance. And because most of these leases require you to be personally liable, it doesn't matter that you have an LLC or some sort of corporate entity, and they make you personally responsible for this. But I really want to emphasize to you guys that if this is a situation that you find yourself in, please get some help, because you are not totally out of luck. I actually just won a case because the landlord has a duty to mitigate their damages. Even if the tenant is in default, even if the tenant can't pay the rent, the landlord has to make reasonable efforts to try to, you know, release that premises or to reduce the damages that they have. So please don't feel like you're, you know, completely out of luck if you find yourself in this situation.
Good point. Congrats.
So yeah, there's always two sides to a lawsuit. And I guess that's sort of the thing that I like to emphasize to people. So ideally, we would love to help you on the front end, and we'd love to be one of the people that you consult with before you get to any of these issues. But if you find yourself on the other end, don't feel like you're totally out of luck. But I do want to take some time and make sure that we have a chance to answer questions if there are any questions. We're pretty much to the end of our spiel anyway. But you know, if there are if there is a dispute with your landlord, I've seen a lot of really great win-win solutions coming out, especially in COVID. People have been, unable to pay the rent, but the landlord is willing to work with them because, it's in their interest to collect some money rather than try to find a new tenant, especially if they're untested or they're not sure how reliable they are. So again, there's a number of reasons why it's in everyone's interest to reach an agreement.
So I've got a couple of questions, both
Sure.
based on your last point there. The first is on that front end, how much, I know the answer to this is ultimately it depends, but how much can someone expect to be charged for that initial lease review from a lawyer or a broker?
So I think for an attorney, it's going to depend on what their hourly rate is, or maybe they have a set amount. Hey, I charge a flat rate of $200 to review a lease. Because my services are free, I don't have a good sense of what the private bar is charging for that, but I would say it's probably going to depend on their hourly rate.
And as far as brokerage services, I would say 90% of the time, if you're having a tenant rep or a buyer rep represent you, that those services are free. Usually you're paid by the landlord or the seller. You do always want to double check that with them. Sometimes landlords say they're not willing to, and then your rep would ask you to reimburse them, in which case usually it would be 3%. For a tenant or buyer rep is really kind of the market is what we typically see. But you should usually expect, if you're having a tenant or a buyer rep, usually that should be covered by the landlord or the seller. It's very similar to residential in that way.
If you get to the back end with issues, are there any sort of, well, not even necessarily if you're experiencing issues in a current lease, if you are looking to lease, and are there any rental assistance programs that either of you are aware of for like micro businesses?
I'm not sure of anything off the top of my head. I think with as far as like paying for like the lease or something like that, I think that would come maybe from the landlord and being flexible about a couple months rent or some of those things. There have been a number of programs through the state of Iowa for COVID that has provided funding, or the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, has provided funding. But beyond that, I don't know of any grants.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't know specifically as well, but I'll have to dig into that, and I'll shoot you an email if I kind of find anything.
Sure, thank you.
Around COVID.
Where's the best place to look for commercial real estate?
Des Moines.
It depends on what your business needs.
Yeah.
So if you need a lot of foot traffic, maybe you want to be somewhere with a lot of foot traffic. If you need a lot of parking, or you're like a catering business, maybe you need a loading zone. It really is just going to depend.
Yeah. Do you need good accessibility to the freeway? Does that visibility matter? Are you a destination location? People find you online, so signage doesn't matter much. You can be in a cheaper area. It makes more sense for you to, have a better build out than it does, be visible from the highway or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely pockets everywhere. Zoning for industrial versus office versus retail. We're definitely seeing a lot of growth in Des Moines metro area, at least with all the kind of redevelopment efforts. And we're seeing so much expand west, but Grimes, and then also LT. I mean, it totally depends on the business model. And something to keep in mind that's also very important is checking out your competition. Where's your competition at? If I was talking to a woman, it's the same one, esthetician and nail salon, and she was at first considering West Des Moines, and I showed her kind of a map of where all of her competition was, and everyone's in West Des Moines. She goes, oh, well, I should really be in more of a kind of neighborhood, used to be, a part of people's routines and not have so much competition. And so she ended up kind of changing gears a bit because she realized there's so much competition. So especially if you're in like retail or sometimes the office users as well, usually industrial, it doesn't matter as much, but that's another thing to consider.
And we had a follow-up on that from Jessica. How about just even where to begin searching? If you have an idea of what type of business, what where
Mhm.
you want your location to be, where do you go to try to find options?
There are some free options. It's usually going to be kind of similar to, once again, residential. There's LoopNet and Crexi. There's some that basically, if the landlord pays for additional exposure, basically if they pay extra, then people can see it on the free end. Once again, it's only giving you a particular visual, because a lot of people aren't going to pay extra for someone to see it on the free end. So only brokers can see some of those. So if you have someone in the industry that's willing to do a search for you, once again, usually that's free to perform. But there's some online resources, just at least if you're kind of still trying to get an idea of things, and maybe you're still working on your business plan and you're just trying to say, well, I have no idea what office rents are like. I need to just, you can usually kind of LoopNet is really like the apartments.com kind of version. And you should be able to get some estimated rents that way at least.
Okay, I want to be very conscious of everyone's time. I know we're all busy on Zoom all day. So we all, I'm sure, have yet another to go to after this.
Mm-hmm.
Sam and Nora, thank you so much for being here with us today. This is such fantastic information. As always, we will send out a follow-up information with some contact info, some additional resources, PowerPoint, et cetera. So everyone who was with us today will get a copy of all of that. With that, I'll say thanks everybody for being here. Thank you again for your help, your expertise. And we'll see everybody next week, maybe.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, everybody. Nora is wonderful. You should definitely work with her. And to the extent that you need somebody to take a look at it from the legal perspective, please at least try to apply. We have some flexibility to help. So
yeah,
so don't be
free
strangers.
resource, you'd be silly to not at least give that a shot.
Yeah. All right.
Hard to come across.
Take care, everybody.
Everybody have a great day.
Bye.